Well, and the last part is the anatomy of the brain. So, brain consists of several main parts. The cerebrum, shown here. Sorry about that. Cerebrum, shown here. It's the part basically thinking, sensory perception, fine motor controls. Cerebellum, unconscious motor controls. Diencephalon, controls of the internal visceral organs and relay of information in the brain stem, unconscious controls of organs as well. Brain is, male brain is a little bit bigger than the female brain. The level of intellect is not linked to the size of the brain. The average volume of the brain is about 1,300 cubic centimeters, and the mass is about 1.4 kilograms. Brain is protected by the fluid, so-called cerebrospinal fluid, that is produced in the brain ventricles. Here you can see one ventricle, another ventricle. Let me change the color for a second. So that's a ventricle here, ventricles here. And brain is basically suspended in the cerebrospinal fluid. It floats in it. It prevents any contact between the brain and the cranium, the skull, so brain doesn't get squashed. It is also protected by 3 layers of meninges. So first layer is pretty thick layer. Here you see it's a dura mater. Dura mater is a pretty thick, very strong, and tough connective tissue beneath the skull partitions the brain and holds it inside the cranium. Under the dura mater is relatively thin arachnoid matter, named so for its resemblance of a spider web. So under the arachnoid matter is the cerebrospinal fluid. So basically the cerebrospinal fluid will be flowing under that arachnoid matter in what is called subarachnoid space, the space between the arachnoid and the pia mater. The pia mater is the innermost layer. It's very, very fine. It clings to the brain, very, very thin. So the space between pia mater and arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space. And the space between the arachnoid and dura mater, this will be subdural space. Okay? So why these spaces are important? For instance, subarachnoid space is the space where there is cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? And also the blood vessels that supply brain are located in the subarachnoid space as well. Now, these blood vessels, if they get ruptured, then the leakage of the blood will lead to the accumulation of the blood into that subarachnoid space, and that may lead to lethal outcomes, result of so-called subarachnoid hematoma. Now, inflammation of meninges, called meningitis, is an extremely severe condition, usually caused by bacteria. It can be caused by viruses and other infectious agents, but most importantly, it's bacteria. This trifecta, Haemophilus influenza, Streptococcus pneumoniae, and Neisseria meningitidis, are 3 causative agents of the meningitis. All 3, by the way, are completely vaccine preventable. So let's talk about cerebrospinal fluid a little bit. So here you can see the anatomy of the brain. This blue colored space, that's actually cerebrospinal fluid. You see it surrounds the brain. It floats it. It's produced in the ventricles. 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle right about here, the 4th ventricle. It drains from the ventricles into subarachnoid space around the brain. It also drains in the central canal in the spinal cord. Not only cerebrospinal fluid cushions the brain, it also helps to maintain the blood-brain barrier. Importantly, cerebrospinal fluid is constantly produced by so-called choroid plexuses. You can see one of the choroid plexuses here on the picture, and it is drained into the arachnoid villi. Here, here, and here are arachnoid villi. If arachnoid villus is blocked or multiple arachnoid villi are blocked, then cerebrospinal fluid has no space to drain into, and that leads to the condition known as hydrocephalus, accumulation of the fluid around the brain. Hydrocephalus leads to the increased pressure on the brain, may lead to severe damage to the brain and even death if the fluid is not drained properly. So one of the parts of the brain that we're going to start with, is brainstem. So here you can see brainstem at the bottom with three major parts: the midbrain here, the pons, that bulging part, and medulla oblongata. General functions of the brain stem. It's the visceral functions, control of various visceral functions: heart rate, breathing, reflexes such as sneezing, vomiting, hiccuping. For instance, midbrain controls visual reflex, following moving object with your eyes, startle reflex when you raise your head when you hear a loud sound, regulates pain, allows the communication between the cerebellum and the brain. Pons here, that bulging part, contains a respiratory center. And medulla oblongata is one of the major controllers of the visceral reflexes, autonomic reflexes, reflexes that you cannot consciously control, reflexes like swallowing or vomiting or sneezing or hiccuping. Medulla oblongata also controls respiratory activities, cardiovascular activities, digestive activities. So you can see that medulla oblongata is an important controller of the visceral functions. Now this little part called cerebellum, or the small brain, is an incredibly important part of the CNS, which produces fine movement patterns, allows us to maintain posture, helps learning different motor skills. Basically, if it is damaged, then the person becomes extremely clumsy. Cerebellum produces these fine motor patterns based on the proprioception, based on receiving the information about the body position in space. It receives the information from the eyes, and it receives the input from the vestibular apparatus, basically input on the balance. So cerebellum, when receives all this information, how we are positioned in space, what our balance conditions are, what surrounds us, it produces the fine motor patterns that lead to precise movements. Now the central part, called diencephalon, contains three separate parts. Diencephalon contains thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. So thalamus here in the center is the part that essentially relays the information, sensory information, to different parts of the brain, of the cortex, different parts of the cerebrum. So for instance, visual information has to go into the visual cortices in the occipital lobe of the brain. It has to go into the cerebellum. Potentially it has to go into the prefrontal cortex. So thalamus will work as the relay system. Hypothalamus controls the visceral functions. It controls endocrine system. It controls heart rate, body temperature, rate of respiration, releasing hormones, responses to the fear, like elevated blood pressure or elevated heart rate when you are scared or you have some excitement experiences, it plays an important role in the memory formation. And finally, epithalamus. This little part here, this part controls the production of hormone melatonin, which helps to control the sleep cycle. Now, this is the cerebrum, the cortex. Okay, so what are the main components of the cerebrum? First of all, cerebrum can be divided into the lobes. So the frontal lobe in front, it's red, parietal lobe, which is blue, occipital lobe, which is green, temporal lobe, which is yellow, and there is an insular lobe, which is really, really deep, which we can't really see, so we're not including it into the list. So what's the function of the cerebrum? It's processing of information, generating of the responses. So it's your conscious thoughts, controls of your conscious muscle movements, conscious appreciation of the sensations, things like that. So the surface of the cerebrum is covered in little creases called sulci, and these creases separate the raised areas called gyri, and yes, the word gyrus singular or gyri plural, and the Greek dish gyro share the same root. This folded structure, the raised and depressed areas, increase the overall surface area of the cerebrum and allow the cerebrum to accommodate more neurons. The outer layer of the cerebrum is called the cortex. It's composed of the gray matter, which is basically non-myelinated parts of the neurons, bodies and dendrites, non-myelinated axons, that's gray matter. And that gray matter is what actually controls things like sensations, voluntary movements, thoughts, so on and so forth. The inner layer of the cerebrum, which is not shown here, is called the white matter, and it consists mainly of myelinated axons. And these myelinated axons are responsible for the communication between different parts of the cerebral cortex. Myelin, as you remember, it provides the electrical insulation and allows for the faster transmission of the impulses in the brain. And these chunks of white matter that connect to different parts of the cerebrum are called white matter tracts. So what are the functions of the nervous system? Well, first of all, brain is separated into two cerebral hemispheres, left and right. And it turns out that they are slightly different in terms of the function. The right hemisphere, mostly responsible for facial recognition, spatial relationships, while the left is responsible for the interpretation of language, speech, logical decisions, writing, speaking, categorization. So it is true that in people who are right-handed, the left hemisphere is dominant, which explains often their better skills at logic and language interpretation, while in the left-handed people, the right hemisphere is dominant, which makes them more capable of facial recognition and spatial orientation, stuff like that. So cortex has three main types of cortical areas, okay? Motor, sensory, and association. So for instance, the primary motor cortex here and the premotor area, they're responsible for the voluntary motor commands. The association areas, such as the anterior association area here, limbic association area, which is not shown here, and there is not shown here the speech recognition area. So they're responsible for higher processing. The association area is responsible for the integration of information, thinking, interpretation of speech, learning. Limbic system, for instance, is responsible for your conscious control of emotions. When you know when to cry, you know when to laugh, and things like that. Okay. And finally, the third type, the sensory cortices, are responsible for conscious interpretation of your sensations. Somatic cortices or somatosensory cortices responsible for the body sensations like pain, temperature, vibration, or touch. Visual cortices are responsible for, well, vision. Auditory cortices responsible for sound interpretation. Olfactory cortices responsible for smell, and gustatory cortices are responsible for taste. There are visceral cortices not shown on the picture. Visceral cortices are responsible for the interpretation of the sensations from the internal organs. Now, lastly, I wanted to say a few words about memory. So memory can be categorized based on the type of memory and longevity of the memory. So memory can be immediate, which is, you listen to me on that video and you immediately remember what I just said, but I don't know, 10 minutes later, you have no idea. Short-term memory, so you listen to that video, you have some knowledge. That knowledge may stick or not. And that short-term memory will inevitably lead to the formation of long-term memory, either via excitement or, repetition, rehearsal, or associating new experiences with your previous data. Okay? Some of that long-term memory will be completely forgotten, completely lost. Okay? Some of the data will be retrievable. But you can see that the more frequent you form short-term memories, the better your long-term memory will be. So I strongly suggest that you watch these videos multiple times. And then finally, the types of memory based on kind of a skill. So you have declarative memory and you have procedural memory. I wanted to point out that in declarative memory, such as memorizing a list, like a class roster, or you memorize a poem, or you memorize all different parts of the brain, that's declarative memory. The main role is played by the prefrontal cortex, part of the brain that's responsible for your personality, for your, memory skills. Now, in procedural memory, you learn an actual motor skill. And to learn a motor skill, you have to engage a motor cortex. So, unlike declarative memory, procedural memory can be hardly forgotten. So, for instance, in procedural memory, like driving a car, riding a bike, you can't forget how to drive a car or how to ride a bike. You can become rusty at it, but you can't really forget. With the declarative memory, you memorized class roster, and 2 years later, you completely forgot it. Okay? So basically, procedural memory can hardly be forgotten, while declarative memory can be easily forgotten. That concludes our conversation about the nervous system, and we will continue with our next chapter, which is special senses.